I just wanted to take a moment and thank you so much for being here. We had such a great turnout. I am so excited to introduce our next speaker, who is another Maine colleague. We're both from Maine, so that's exciting to see him here today. Andrew Carpenter is a certified soil scientist, certified crop advisor, and certified nutrient management planning specialist. Andrew has been recycling organic residuals and developing recycling programs for materials that have not been historically reused since 1992. He has extensive experience in research, planning, and handling technical issues related to the reuse of organic residuals. Andrew received a Master of Science in Plant, Soil, and Environmental Science from the University of Maine. He founded Northern Tilth, LLC, an environmental consulting firm focused on organic waste management and building soil health. That was in 2003. Andrew is currently a trustee of the Compost Research and Education Foundation. So if you can join me in a round of applause for Andrew.
Thank you. This is being videotaped, so I can't say anything untoward. I'm going to be very careful about that. I'm going to give you a little bit of the background for what I'm talking about today. Are all of you familiar with the Natural Resource Conservation Service? Okay. So it is, the NRCS came out of the Dust Bowl. It used to be called the Soil Conservation Service, and it was basically a response to the Dust Bowl, the sort of identifying a need that there were some resource concerns related to soil, like losing, millions and millions of tons of it. And a lot of soil science developed out of that. And so they started off with practices specifically to preserve soil, to try and keep soil in place. So a lot of their early practices were things like cover cropping. They got into minimal tillage, diversions, crop rotation, things that would help keep soil in place. They've since increased their focus, so they're not only focused on soil quality, but they're focused on water quality as well. A lot of the work that we do for them, on behalf of them, is related to preserving both soil quality and water quality. They get into air quality a little bit, but the way their program works, the protocol is that they have defined practices that they know in certain situations will help preserve soil quality and water quality, and they have a program, a cost share program, to help farms implement those practices. Essentially, they pay farms to do things that will preserve water quality and soil quality. It's a very tangible organization that does very tangible practices that really do result in a preservation of soil and water quality. And I don't work for them. I like what they do. I like their mission, and as a company, we do a lot of work for farms, on behalf of farms that are working with or cooperating with the NRCS. They have a program called the Conservation Innovation Grant Program, and what that is in place for is to try out new practices that they think might be promising and they might be able to take on as their own in order to provide cost share for farms. So as a company, one of the things that we do is we're technical service providers for the NRCS. So when a farm signs up with the NRCS, if they need something like a nutrient management plan, a soil health management plan, grazing plan, things like that, that farm is paid to hire someone like us to do that initial work and then recommend practices that we know the NRCS can pay for. So the Conservation Innovation Grant Program is designed to look for potential new practices. So to try them out, see if they work, see if they would become one of the tools that the NRCS uses. And we've gotten 4 of those grants so far, one in Vermont, one in New Hampshire, one in Maine, and the one I'm going to talk about is in Connecticut. They're for various things. 2 of them were for reducing phosphorus solubility in fields that have high phosphorus. One of them that we're currently working on is to reduce PFAS uptake of crops on fields that have been contaminated by PFAS. The one I'm talking about today is providing technical assistance to farms that have on-farm composting programs to see if we can help essentially make that composting operation more effective and, more importantly, in the eyes of the NRCS, help reduce any water quality or soil quality program. So the successful outcome of this project would be a new practice that would pay farmers to hire someone who's a composting expert to help them improve their on-farm composting operations. And the reason we did this is we work with farms all over New England. We see a lot of different types of on-farm composting operations, some of which are very successful, some of which aren't, but it often seems like there's some relatively simple technical assistance that some of these farms could use to improve their operation. We're essentially testing that process out. We're seeing, like, can we provide good technical assistance that will actually improve an on-farm composting operation? So for this one, we are working with 6 farms in Connecticut, 2 of which are represented here today, if not more. If there are more and I missed you, sorry. And they're all sort of at various stages in their composting operation. Some of them have really long-term, well-refined, mature processes. Some of them have just gotten started. Some of them clearly need some technical assistance to help move their project forward. So for these 6 farms, what we're doing, we're actually pretty close to the end of the grant at this point, is going to those farms, doing a very thorough assessment of their composting operation, looking at it from the eyes of the NRCS, like, are there resource concerns here, concerns with water quality, but also, really importantly, are there things that, based on the goals that that farmer has for composting, are there things that we can do to make that process a little bit more efficient and effective? I want to talk about organic matter transformations in soil. I'm going to get into a little bit of the basics of composting as well, because I think it's good to go back a little bit. So we have this magical process on Earth where we can actually take carbon dioxide and water and turn it into sugars and start this process of building biomass from CO2 and water. It's a very incredible process. It's basically the basics of life. And when we create that organic matter, ultimately we're creating a lot of byproducts. We poop goes somewhere, we eat, food waste goes somewhere, we're generating manure on farms, plants are dying all the time and decomposing in the soil. Ultimately, you hope that most of that biomass ends up in the soil in one form or another. And what happens when it hits the soil is the microbes that are there. There are billions of microbes in every gram of soil, even in relatively sterile soils. They get very excited. That's food for them. So they see that organic matter and they derive energy from the carbon-oxygen bond. They oxidize that organic carbon bond. They derive energy from that process. And they're also using some of that carbon for their own biomass. They proliferate, they get very excited again when you add that fresh organic matter to the soil. So they incorporate some of that into their own biomass, and in the end, it's actually, we don't call it humus anymore, but that's another hour and a half or 2 hour talk. We have stable forms of carbon that stay in the soil, and that's the stuff we're really after. That's the long-term pool of soil organic matter that helps reduce erosion. It provides a long-term pool of soil nutrients. It decreases the bulk density of soil, makes it a little fluffier so water can permeate and also hold on to it a little bit. And in that process, we're naturally losing about 2/3 of that carbon to carbon dioxide goes back. But it is a natural pump over time. This is why people talk about carbon sequestration being so important. We have a natural pump that's bringing some of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into biomass and ultimately into the soil. Reason I bring this up is there are a lot of things that you can do with organic waste. Composting is only one of those things that you can do. We work with a lot of direct land application of manures and other materials where you're not composting it beforehand, you're just simply applying it to the field in order to meet the nutrient needs of the crops, to displace chemical fertilizers, and also in the meantime build up the organic carbon in the soil. Composting, essentially The difference between land application and composting is you're doing the work that the microbes are going to do in the soil with that material that you land apply before you actually add it to the soil. So they're going in that compost pile, they're even more excited than they are in the soil because you've created the perfect environment for them to oxidize that organic matter and transform some of that organic matter into more stable carbon, more recalcitrant carbon that's going to stick around in the soil for a while. Anaerobic digestion you can think of as sort of halfway between the two. In anaerobic digestion, you're taking that organic matter and you're putting it in a enclosed environment devoid of oxygen. And in that case, you're encouraging methanogens, not aerobic bacteria, but anaerobic bacteria, to transform some of that carbon into methane, and then you can capture the methane and use that as an energy source. Methane is essentially the same thing as natural gas. And then there's even, I'm not as high on biochar as a lot of people are, but that's another thing that you can do. You can actually take that carbon, put it in again, an enclosed chamber, expose it to high heat without oxygen, and convert that carbon into a graphite-like structure, which is incredibly recalcitrant. Once that's added to the soil, it's there for millennia. But all of these different things are things you can do. Composting isn't necessarily the best or worse. In some cases, it's a great option. In some cases, some of the other options are good. And again, because I'm going to be talking about the success and recommendations of compost, I want to go back to the basics a little bit. In order to have an ideal setup for composting, you need a few things. You need that organic matter, that's the food for those microbes. You need oxygen because it's an oxygen-driven reaction. It's an oxidative reaction. It's microbial oxidation, as opposed to, say, chemical oxidation, which you get when you're burning something. You need water because the microbes need a certain balance of water to be able to do that work. And then you need the right amount, a really good balance of carbon and nitrogen. Because, I was saying I do get a little long-winded at times. Microbes, their biomass is about 8-to-1 in terms of carbon to nitrogen. And as I said before, you get about 2/3 of that carbon in the initial feedstock is going off into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So if you think about the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio to feed those microbes, it's about 24-to-1. You got 2/3 of it going off the atmosphere, and that the remaining 8 again essentially staying with the microbes. So that can vary a lot. You can compost way outside of that range successfully, but that's sort of that's where that sort of notion comes from of having the right balance. A couple additional factors are pH, temperature. If it gets too cold, you're not going to be encouraging the microbes, or you have to do more work to encourage the microbes to do the work. And then the volatile solids, which is simply organic matter content. You need fresh organic matter. If you try and compost something that's already been composted, it's not going to work very effectively in your pile. So I won't go too much into this because I do want to get to the individual farms, and I am a little bit long-winded. But you do also, one thing that's really important, and will come up in this a bunch, is the bulk density of the pile. Those piles, the composting piles, need air going through them. They need some moisture. But if they're too compact, if they have too high of a bulk density, the air is going to have trouble transferring in and out of there. When the microbes are pulling air in, they're sending carbon dioxide out. They need essentially a porous environment. So typically somewhere between 600 to maybe 1,100 pounds per cubic yard is a good area to be in terms of bulk density. And this will come up again. You need the right balance of carbon and nitrogen. Like I say, different feedstocks have different properties. Manure tends to be very low in carbon to nitrogen. Sawdust tends to be very high. Either one of them on their own might be a little hard to compost, but when you add the two of them together to get somewhere between maybe 20 to 35-to-1 C to N ratio, you're going to be in the pocket that the microbes like and can potentially thrive in. And this is really important, is temperature monitoring and managing your pile in accordance with what you see is going on with the temperature. And this means using probes. I mean, it's a very simple process. Compost thermometers are cheap. But it's a matter of making sure not only initially that your temperatures are increasing, but as you see, say in a windrow composting operation, they're going to get a certain amount of air in there when you're actually incorporating the piles and you're making them in the first place. The microbes are going to use that up. They're going to get very excited, be very active, get up in the thermophilic range, and then they're going to exhaust the oxygen that's in there, and you'll see your temperatures start to go back down. So when they do start to drop, that's an indication now it's time for me to incorporate some more air into that pile. And so that cycle, I'm not really nervous, but see, that's very far away. So it looks like I'm shaking, but I'm not. But you go down, add some air, the microbes get happy again because they have some air in there. They're breaking down some of that remaining stuff, and you follow this process until essentially there's a point where they're not excited anymore. They've expended, they've gone through a lot of the readily available carbon, and your compost is getting mature. Does everyone follow all of that so far? The other thing is, and this is really important, and this has been come back time and time again with the farms that we work with, is the concept of trial and error. Because you can read compost handbooks all you want, but you might have a mix that's meeting all of the criteria that should be perfect for composting, and you still are not getting good results. So it's really important if you're a composter to be excited about the idea of saying, well, this isn't working. What if I take this? What if I take this component out and put this back, or replace it with this, or I put a little less of this in and a little more of that? It's really informative, and it's something that a book can't necessarily tell you. And my guidance on that when you're doing it is to shift your recipes significantly so that you can at least learn, like, okay, I took out all of the straw that I was using in there, and it didn't help. So the straw is not a factor. And same thing with anything. Anytime you're adjusting your recipe to try and figure out what you can do to make a better recipe, I encourage big changes, not just little shifts. The other thing, and this is, we sort of knew this going into the project, but we know it more now, is what is the goal of composting? Because if you look at compost textbooks or go to composting school, a lot of what you're going to be driven towards is sort of this ideal conditions to take compost and make a finished product that you can bag and sell on the open market. But in fact, most of the on-farm composting operations that we work with aren't doing that. Some of them are and some of them aren't. But that's not necessarily always the goal. Sometimes it's just managing mortalities. Sometimes it's managing and trying to manage a wet material. Sometimes it's a heterogeneous material that would be good to have mixed up a little bit before you apply it. Sometimes you have too much carbon and you're trying to avoid tying up carbon in the soil. Because if the carbon to nitrogen ratio of fresh organic matter going into soil is too high, the microbes in the soil that are naturally occurring are going to outcompete plants for the nitrogen that's in there, and you'll get some starving. So that's what happens when you add a lot of, say, sawdust to your garden without adding any nitrogen. So there's a whole host of things, and then there is the sort of the thing that we often think of is like, I want to take this material, I want to make it into a product that I can sell for $60 a yard or bag and sell for $8 for 2 pounds. But again, that's one way to go. It's not the primary goal of most of the people that are doing on-farm composting. And a lot of times, farms are working somewhere in between. They're trying to manage materials, but they also want to make a material that is sellable. So most of them are some sort of hybrid of like that sort of idealized thing and just trying to manage materials on the farms. So I'm going to go into, how am I doing on time?
You got 30 minutes.
Oh, I haven't been as long-winded as I wanted to be. Any questions so far?
Good.
Okay. So you all are following me. Okay. The first farm that we worked with is a beef operation that just got a bedded pack facility built with them. This was a cost share from the NRCS in order to provide manure storage to help reduce potential water contamination issues. It's a state-of-the-art bedded pack. The farm runs it perfectly. It's really nice. At the far end of this facility, the NRCS designed these 3 bins that were meant for composting what they take up out of the bedded pack. Everyone familiar with a bedded pack? Okay, I don't need to talk about bedded packs. I guess the one thing I will say is what comes out of a bedded pack typically, because it's a heavily bedded manure, is often a great feedstock for composting. In this case though, this design without aeration is horrible for composting. With the exception of the front of the piles, there's no air getting into any of these piles. So the material, it ages a little bit, but it does not compost. And in order to make this a system that would work, it would involve cutting holes in the back, having probably 1 horsepower blowers over there, putting tubes down the bottom, blowing air through it, and you would have an aerated static pile system. But without the blowers, it's sort of a storage system. So we talked to this farm, after we started the process. Again, like the material going in here is an ideal feedstock for composting. It would make a really nice finished manure-based compost, but it wasn't composting in there. The temperatures were going up a little bit. In fact, the farm was more interested in spreading that material on their own land. It didn't need to be composted. And as a matter of fact, this is a little bit of a digression for me, because sometimes I find that I'm talking farmers into not composting. And the reason is this, especially as it pertains to manure. If you look at what plants take up for nitrogen and phosphorus, it's typically, what am I at? I think I'm doing pretty well. I feel like I'm doing all right. But thank you. I mean, I asked you for that, so. Plants typically take up 2 to 3 times more nitrogen than they do phosphorus. Manure, in terms of plant available nutrients, has about sometimes 2 times as much phosphorus as it does nitrogen. Farms spend much more money and have a greater need for nitrogen than they do for phosphorus. When you compost material, phosphorus is conserved in the process. It doesn't go away. It remains in the compost. Nitrogen, on the other hand, becomes less plant available. So with manure, you already have an imbalance. Once you compost it, you've exacerbated that imbalance. And if your goal, like this what the farmer was to replace fertilizers for growing grass, you can spend a lot of money on nitrogen. If you compost that manure before you spread it, you're losing some of that nitrogen, so you're going to have to buy more fertilizer. So in this case, it was designed in mind. The design was to have compost bins at the end. Really, they didn't need them. They have good storage for them, and that farmer, that was basically it for the project for the farm. They have a great source of manure now. They've got good storage for it. They're spreading it on their land, and they're getting more nitrogen out of that than they would have if they had composted it. Farm 2, they got an aerated static pile. This is a horse farm that's in Connecticut. They have a riding arena. They do training. It's a great facility. A lot of experience, a lot of horses boarded there. A lot of training goes on there. Manure is aside, it's just a pain in the ass that they have to deal with. They worked with the NRCS, and the NRCS ultimately ended up designing and paying for them to build what's really a state-of-the-art aerated static pile system. So they do have blowers in the back. They are getting air through these piles. But it still wasn't, and it's covered, which is, for most compost facilities in New England, that would be great. In this case, it actually wasn't good. And I'll go into that a little while. I'll go into it in the next slide. Essentially, what they were finding was, from when they first loaded down here, where they have aeration in the first 2 bins, to the time they were storing it and curing it back here, it hadn't composted that much. They were still getting relatively high temperatures in the material that was already composted. And it simply wasn't a completely mature compost. And it also, because of that, wasn't reducing in volume quite as much as one would expect. So they had more material to deal with on this end. They're not selling the material either. So in this case, that's important in terms of the goals of the composting. So their feedstocks, unlike so many farms that we work with, were actually too dry for ideal composting. And they found, and this was an interesting thing, they actually had sprinklers on top of this. But if you start adding water to it after it's composted, the material becomes a little hydrophobic. It doesn't actually absorb that water, and a lot of it was then spraying out the bottom and wasn't making the whole material as moist as we would want for ideal composting. So they easily achieved temperatures, but it really wasn't composting thoroughly. The timers on their aeration were set to kick on only when the compost temperature got extraordinarily high, which is not ideal. So anyway, our assessments based on these were to add moisture to the pile as they were actually building the piles, as they were taking the manure in. The C to N ratio was low, or was very high, so we had them add a little bit of nitrogen. Also at the beginning, we changed their aeration timer to pulse, as opposed to just turning on when the piles got too hot. So they did get a big improvement. This is actually after they started doing this, and the finished compost did look a little better. But it proved to be a lot of work for them that was outside of the scope of what they want to do as a business to make this composting operation work correctly. So they found that they could get a nicer compost, especially the adding water at the beginning. I mean, they're literally bringing the bedded manure out with a wheelbarrow and spraying some water on it at that time. All of that was a lot of effort. It's a system that is now working much better than it was, but in a way, it's one of the interesting things about being down here. I actually think their material would be a great feedstock for somebody else that's composting. It's a dry material. It's high in a C to N ratio. It would probably, and they don't sell again, they're not really focused on selling this. They're trying to get rid of it at the end. So in a way, this would have as much value going to somebody who was composting that needed a relatively dry carbon amendment than having them go through this entire composting process. The third one.
Do you think, sorry,
Yeah.
is NRCS not asking the right questions when they're putting money into these sorts of, like the goals aren't well articulated, it sounds like, if they're putting in these systems that are a Cadillac and then they really truly don't meet the needs of, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that happens a lot. It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the NRCS's fault, but yeah, and that's part of sort of the outcomes of this project. Is that you need to be really focused on what specifically is the goal of the farm. Because when I first got there, I'd never seen anything that NRCS built like this. It's great. And for certain farms, it's a Cadillac. But in the case of this particular farm, it might not have been the best fit. But they are, there is some success here. They're definitely doing better. They're getting more volume reduction. It's composting faster. But yeah, that's a big take-home of this whole thing, is identifying those goals at first, because all the farms are totally different. So this one I love. It's actually nearby here. It's a piggery. It's been that way for generations. They've been collecting, just like in the old style, collecting food waste from all around town to feed the pigs. And then they sell, piglets, or they sell the meat. It's a sort of an old school operation, but they've now started composting the pig manure, and along with leaves that they're getting from nearby towns, food waste that isn't fed for one reason or another to the pigs. And they get a really beautiful compost that they sell. It's a sort of a coarse operation in that it's a big mass. It's one big mass. So they actually get good temperatures when they first start making it, but then they're moving forward this way, so the stuff in here after it's getting covered isn't cooking quite as much. It hasn't affected them so much to date because they're excavating from the back where material's been sitting for many years, and it is beautiful. But there are, there are definitely some improvements that could happen there. their current blend in terms of C/N ratio, we do feedstock analyses for all these farms. In terms of C/N ratio, it's beautiful. It does get up to temperature really quickly. One of the things that's really important is, if I go back, I wonder how long that would take me. Okay, see that line right there? That orange. Oh, see, if I wasn't so nervous, I'd go right along there like that. So that's the temperature at which, if you keep compost up at that temperature for over 5 days in an aerated static pile, or over 15 days in a windrow composting operation, you are going to kill pathogens. You're going to kill human pathogens. Importantly, pigs have similar guts to us, so they have similar pathogens. So it's also, if you're getting up there, you're going to be doing a good job of killing weed seeds. So if you're using this in vegetable gardens, or you're using it to raise feed, you're using it, selling it to an organic vegetable farmer, you really, or any vegetable farmer, you really need to do that pathogen reduction. It's really critical, especially if you have pig manure in it. It's important that you should be getting it for any type of manure, but it's a little bit more critical for pigs, just because their gut has kind of similar pathogens to what we have. So in this case, they need a little bit more diligence in making sure they're maintaining those temperatures for long enough to kill those pathogens. They have, and this happens a lot, it's not on a paved surface, it's on dirt. They end up incorporating a lot of the dirt. By the time they're turning these piles and then scooping the finished pile out, that material almost looks like soil as much as compost. And the more you add soil to it, and this happens with a lot of farms, the higher the bulk density, and the higher the bulk density, again, the air's not going to get in there and help the microbes to do the work of breaking down that organic material. So in this case, really, they've got a great operation in place. They've got a good market for the finished material. They are investigating switching to having it be on a paved pad with windrows, so they can access those windrows and turn them on a regular schedule until they've gotten through that final process, but also not incorporate so much soil into the compost. And then this is a diversified livestock vegetable operation that do everything under the sun, including having a food truck. And they are composting a mix of bedded manure from beef, hogs, goats, chickens. They get leaves and wood chips from landscapers. They have some food waste that they collect, and also biomass from the vegetable operation. And our initial finding here was it just wasn't getting up to temperature. And it was pretty clear. It was actually, in terms of the feedstocks, the mix of them was pretty good. Like the C/N ratio was good, it looked good on paper. But the bulk density was too high, and it was the same thing. They're collecting manure from areas where they're picking up soil as they do it. It's simply the bulk density was too high for the air to get in there for the microbes to do the work. So we did, this one we were able to do, the farmer was excited about this, and we did a few trial piles trying to work with some manure that had a little less soil collected in it, but also tweak the recipes with the leaves and some of the other amendments. They had coffee grounds, a few other things. We ended up making 2 pretty different piles to see how they would do. And came up with a recipe that got up to 140 degrees within, I think it was a week or so. And this was actually in November, so it wasn't warm weather. So it was really, at least in terms of the trial and error portion here, it was good. They are also, at the same time, that farm is going to be getting a bedded pack themselves. So they'll have a scrapable surface to get the manure from, and won't have all the soil incorporated into it. Farm 5 is, I've been trying to be anonymous about the farms, but I don't think the Collins would mind that Collins Powder Hill Farm, they've had a really successful compost program for a long, long time. They've got a great market for the compost. So this was sort of on the other end of some of the farms that we've been working with. They have a bagging operation. It is a dairy and they're using their own manure, and they also get a lot of leaves from nearby towns. They have a good mix. So there wasn't a whole lot we could help them with the exception of making the composting process itself a little bit more efficient. They have a lot of room, and they let the material sit for a long period of time. It doesn't necessarily get up to real high temperatures, but they do turn it regularly, and they ultimately, like I say, get a very nice finished process. Our recommendations here and what they've started doing is monitoring the pot. Oh, 10 minutes, good. Yeah, I think I'm in good shape, but thank you. They haven't been monitoring the piles. They've just sort of been turning them when they can get to them. We know that if they follow sort of the guidance that we were doing before and turn as the temperatures start to go down, that they could make that process more efficient, which essentially would reduce the amount of time that they need for composting, and ultimately that reduces the amount of space that the farm needs for composting, which does, it can be pretty large after a while. And then this is the last farm. This is a relatively good-sized dairy, conventional dairy, that's managing its mortalities through composting. So I don't know if you all are aware of this, but it really right now, that's what the NRCS recommends for dealing with mortalities as opposed to burying them or doing something else. It's a great way to go. If you do it effectively, you can compost everything. You will find maybe some hip bones and things like that, but if you do it effectively, you're essentially composting the entire animal, even if it's a rather large animal. So their mortality composting was kind of in the back 40, which is often the case. You sort of don't want it right around you. And the coyotes are coming, knocking at the door. But also, it was sited in a way that some of the runoff was going down, sort of downslope from here, killing some of these trees. It was not on a paved surface. It wasn't necessarily managed, although it was getting pretty good temperatures. It was effective in breaking down the material, but the finished product also wasn't something that was that great for selling, which they had an interest in doing. So the first thing we did was recommend shifting their recipe a little bit, adding a little bit more of spent silage that they had on the farm into the piles, and then moving the pile to another location. They did that right away, and it was incredibly effective. They got high temperatures off the bat. It was a really nice mix. So that process was speeding up. But the exciting thing here is after they found that this was sort of working out well, they took several more steps. And they started to make larger and larger piles with more materials, not just the mortalities. And they now have a good bulk market for that material. It's beautiful finished compost. And now they've really done 3 iterations. They went from that old mass in the back to a separate location where they were composting more quickly with a little better recipe, then moved up front where they were making these bigger piles and developed a market for that. And now they even have a larger in place windrow composting operation that's working really effectively. So that's the 6 farms. So back to your question about the NRCS, and I think this is one of the big take-home messages is every farm has really different goals for composting material. And so the recommendations that you give to any one farm, and even the design that you give to a farm when they're just starting off the process, should take that into account, because an aerated static pile might work perfectly for somebody, but for someone else they might just need manure storage, or they might be better off with a windrow for one reason or another. Also, the measurements that you can take to help assess whether your pile should be tweaked, is working well, are really simple. They're things that you can do in the field. So the compost thermometers are not expensive. They're about $160 a piece. You don't need millions of them. One really would do the work if you go poke around a little bit. There's a squeeze test that you can do that often is effective, and essentially with a rubber glove, well, you don't even have to have a rubber glove, but you take the material that you've built into a pile and you squeeze it, and if you start to get like little drips out of here, it's probably a good moisture content. If you get nothing, it's probably a little too dry. And if it's sopping wet, then it's probably a little wet. It's not perfect, but it'll get you in the ballpark. And the same with what I think is really important, we find this on so many farms, is that the bulk density is too high. All you need to do is take a 5-gallon bucket and a scale, a field scale out there, and weigh. What we end up doing is filling that bucket, dropping it 5 times, filling it up again, dropping it 5 more times, so it sort of settles like it might in a pile, and then measure the weight of that. And then we know from, it's 5 gallons, you do that conversion to a yard, that many pounds per 5 gallons, you convert that to a yard. Are you in the pocket? Are you somewhere between 600 and say 1,000? Or are you way off, maybe too light or too not dense enough or too dense? It's a really simple measurement. And then, just visual assessments too can really help you out. For composting operations that do not have forced aeration, there are people that use rules of thumb for how many times you should turn a pile. I think it makes a lot more sense to monitor the temperature of the pile to inform when you should turn that pile. And also, this is really important. It can be a fun process, but it's really important to be willing to go through the trial and error process to see what actually does work, because textbooks often won't give the answer that you need for your particular farm. And so the process of tweaking these recipes, it's sort of a mysterious and dynamic process, composting. So it's important that you're comfortable with trying these things out, as opposed to saying it's not working, even though I have the right seed-to-N ratio, the right bulk density, the right moisture. You really need to be able to want to experiment with this. I think this is critical for on-farm composting operations that are selling the finished compost or are using it on their own for vegetable production, as opposed to if you're going on a hayfield or cornfield, it doesn't matter so much. But if you're using it in vegetable production, it is really important that you meet that pathogen reduction criteria through raising the temperature up there for a certain period of time. And the goal, NRCS's goal is resource concern. It's not necessarily the marketing of it. That's not that relevant to the talk, but it is something to keep in mind. And yeah, no two composting operations are the same. So yeah, essentially those are our findings. I do want to thank all the 6 farmers that we've worked with. It's been really, for me, this is a really fun project. They've all been really willing partners and willing to tweak things and respond to my annoying emails and phone calls and stuff. And the NRCS too for funding the grant. And we have, so I'm not quite there, I have 3 minutes before I have to give you time for questions. There is a new program that's fledgling that the NRCS has that most of the states don't actually know how to administer yet, even though they have it on the books, and it's called the Soil Carbon Amendment Practice. And maybe some of you have heard of it. It's NRCS Practice 336, and this is a practice that actually pays farms to purchase compost. It's been something that the NRCS has been working on for 10 years. They've had it on the books now, first in a pilot phase for a few years. Now it's a full-fledged practice. The problem is, while ultimately this will get off the ground, often their practices are slow to catch on. And slow to, if you think of a field office or even a state office, they get handed down this mandate, here's this new practice that you have to have, with not that much guidance on how to administer it. My experience is, and I love this program, I think it's great. If you think of all the ideas that people have out there for getting paid for carbon, most of them don't work in an agricultural setting, especially in New England. But in this case, it's very tangible. It's simply the NRCS paying farms that show that they have a need, maybe through low organic matter or any one of a few different criteria, actually paying them to purchase compost, and the payment rates are pretty good. I encourage, in order to push this forward, because so few states are actually doing it, I encourage farmers that participate with NRCS to go in and apply for this practice. And for farms that already have on-farm composting operations, they actually have a payment to farms for using their own compost, which is also, it's a pretty good payment. So your first try, you might not get it because, again, NRCS is still in the infancy of this program, but it's a program that I really hope catches on. And so I encourage people to push it forward by going, if you're a farmer and cooperating with the NRCS, applying for that practice. John.
I'm John.